If you've ever felt like your life suddenly lost all meaning, if something that used to matter intensely just stopped making sense one day, if you woke up feeling like a stranger in a life you built but can't recognize anymore, then you haven't had a breakdown, you've had a breakthrough. What most people call a midlife crisis, an existential crisis, or even depression, science and thousands of years of wisdom traditions now recognize as something entirely different, the beginning of a profound shift in human consciousness. And what's fascinating is this: every single person who has ever been recognized as spiritually awakened, from the Buddha to mystic saints to modern-day scientists who've had near-death experiences, they all went through the same identifiable stages. In this documentary, we're going to walk through each of those stages in order, and we're going to look at what ancient traditions described thousands of years ago, what modern psychology and neuroscience have now confirmed, and, most importantly, what these stages mean for you right now. Because here's the thing, nobody tells you. Most people experiencing a spiritual awakening think something is terribly wrong with them. They pull away, they isolate, they try to go back to who they were before, and they can't. If you're in that place right now, this is the documentary you've been looking for. And I promise, by the end, you will see everything that's been happening to you in a completely different light. Every journey of awakening begins with the same experience, not a vision, not a mystical flash of light. It begins with a hollow feeling, a quiet, persistent sense that something is missing. You've done everything right. Maybe you got the job, the relationship, the house. Maybe you hit the goal you'd been chasing for years, and then you stood there, having arrived, and felt absolutely nothing. This is what psychologists call existential disillusionment, and spiritual traditions have been describing it for millennia. The ancient Greeks had a word for it: kenosis, emptying. Buddhism describes it as dukkha, a pervasive unsatisfactoriness that cannot be filled by anything the material world offers. The philosopher Blaise Pascal wrote about it in the 17th century. He said that every person carries within themselves a God-shaped hole, an infinite abyss that cannot be filled by anything finite. Modern neuroscience has started to catch up. Researchers studying the default mode network, the part of your brain active when you're thinking about yourself, your past, your future, have found something remarkable. When the DMN becomes overactive, it creates what scientists call a contracted sense of self. You become trapped inside your own mental loops. You begin to notice that the stories you've been telling yourself about who you are, what you're supposed to achieve, what will make you happy, they don't hold up to scrutiny anymore. The trap most people fall into. Here's where most people go wrong. When this emptiness arrives, the natural reaction is to fill it. A new goal, a new relationship, a new city, a new distraction. But the emptiness is not a problem to be solved. It's a signal, a precise, intelligent signal from the deepest part of your being that the identity you've been living inside has run its course. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chödrön describes this stage with startling clarity. She writes that groundlessness, the feeling that nothing solid exists to stand on, is not the enemy of peace. It is the doorway to it. What's the practical thing you can do at this stage? Stop trying to fix the feeling. Sit with the emptiness instead of running from it. Journal about what specifically no longer makes sense. The questions that arise in this stage are not signs that something is wrong with you. They are the most alive part of you waking up, Because the next stage comes for everyone who stops running. And it changes everything. I have to be honest with you about this stage. Because the way it's described online, usually with aesthetic rain photos and poetic captions, does not do justice to how brutal it actually is. The dark night of the soul is not a poetic metaphor. It is a full psychological and spiritual crisis. And if you're in it right now, you know exactly what I mean. The term itself comes from a 16th century Spanish mystic and poet named Saint John of the Cross. He wrote his famous poem while imprisoned, thrown in jail for his spiritual views, in complete darkness and isolation. What he described was not depression, though it shares many characteristics. He described the systematic dismantling of every false foundation the ego rests on. Everything that gave your life structure begins to collapse. Your sense of identity, your beliefs, your certainty about the future. Your relationships may shift dramatically. Your old goals become meaningless. And most painfully, the spiritual highs you may have experienced earlier, those moments of beautiful clarity, seem to disappear entirely. What science says is actually happening. A 2022 study published in the journal Explore looked at scientists and academics who had undergone spontaneous spiritual awakening experiences. What they found was striking. Participants described profound transformations in their values, their sense of identity, and their sense of purpose. But these transformations were consistently preceded by a period of acute disorientation and loss. What the brain is actually doing during a dark night is dismantling what psychologists call the narrative self, the story your mind has been constructing about who you are since childhood. And that process, while ultimately liberating, is deeply destabilizing while it's happening. Eckhart Tolle, whose work on presence and consciousness has reached millions, describes the dark night from personal experience. He has spoken openly about spending nearly 2 years in a state of profound inner turmoil and suicidal depression before what he describes as a complete collapse of the ego. What came after changed his life entirely. The dark night is not something gone wrong. It is the ego dying, and what dies is not you. What dies is a fiction, the rigid, defended story of who you thought you had to be. How to navigate this stage? There are several things that research and tradition agree on when it comes to moving through a dark night, rather than getting stuck in it. First, do not try to force your way back to the person you were before. That person served their purpose. The collapse you're experiencing is not failure. It's completion. Second, this is one of the few moments in life where professional support is genuinely invaluable. Not to fix you, you're not broken, but to help you have a witness for what you're going through. Someone who can confirm what you're experiencing has a name, it has a process, and it ends. Speaking of that, one of the most important things I've learned is that navigating deep inner change almost always goes better with the right kind of support. Whether you're in the middle of a dark night or simply working through the deeper questions this stage brings up, having someone skilled to talk to makes a profound difference. Sponsor slot. Whatever your approach to that looks like, don't underestimate its value here. But for those who make it through this stage, and I want to tell you clearly, you will, what waits on the other side is one of the most disorienting and beautiful experiences a human being can have. There is a moment, and it arrives differently for everyone, when the darkness breaks. Not dramatically, not with trumpets, usually in the most ordinary circumstances. You're washing dishes, You're looking at a tree, you're sitting in traffic, and suddenly, without warning, the filter you've been looking through your entire life drops away. And for a moment, 10 seconds, 30 seconds, maybe longer, you see things as they actually are. The Zen Buddhist tradition calls this Satori, a momentary flash of what they describe as your original nature. Not something you have to achieve or earn or build, something that was always already there, temporarily obscured by the constant noise of thinking. William James, the father of American psychology, studied these experiences extensively in the early 20th century. He identified 4 defining characteristics: noetic quality, meaning they feel like genuine insight, not emotion; transiency, they don't last; passivity, you don't make them happen; and ineffability, you cannot fully describe them in words. What neuroscience has discovered, researchers at Johns Hopkins University, using fMRI brain imaging, have now documented what happens in the brain during these peak experiences. What they found is that the brain's default mode network, the self-referential system that generates your ongoing narrative about yourself, goes dramatically quiet. The experience of the self dissolves, or rather, the constructed self dissolves, and what remains is pure awareness. Not your awareness, just awareness. This is what every tradition, Buddhist, Hindu, Sufi, Christian, mystical, has been pointing to for thousands of years. And now we have images of it. Here's what's critical to understand about this stage. The glimpse is not the destination. Many people experience their first Satori and then spend years trying to recreate it. This is a trap that can actually delay awakening rather than accelerate it. The glimpse is a compass, not the destination. It shows you the direction. It confirms that there is something real beyond the ego's construction, and then it invites you to begin the actual work. What's practical here? First, write down the experience, not to analyze it, to honor it. These moments have an extraordinary quality of feeling more real than ordinary reality, and that impression tends to fade. Document it. Second, resist the urge to share it immediately with everyone around you. These experiences are fragile in the early stages. They need space to settle before they can be articulated. The traditions speak of this as protecting the fire before it becomes a flame. After the first glimpse, there's a dangerous temptation, the temptation to think you've arrived, to declare yourself awakened, to build a new identity around spiritual experience. This stage, which teachers sometimes call spiritual bypass, is where more people get stuck than at any other point, because it feels like progress. It looks like progress, but it's actually a more sophisticated version of the same ego game. The genuine deepening of consciousness is a subtler process. It's not measured in spiritual experiences. It's measured in what changes in your daily life, in how you respond to difficulty, in what you no longer need, in what you can hold space for that used to trigger you. Every major wisdom tradition, from Theravada Buddhism to the Christian contemplative path to Sufi mysticism, describes this stage as the cultivation of what they call beginner's mind, the understanding that the more you truly know, the less you are certain of. The role of practice. This is where practice becomes not optional, but essential. And practice here doesn't mean sitting on a cushion for hours a day, though that has its place. Practice means bringing conscious attention to the moments of ordinary life where the ego reasserts itself, the moment of irritation in traffic, the moment of craving for recognition, the moment of anxiety about the future. These are not failures. These are exactly where the work is. The philosopher and former Harvard professor Ram Dass described this with characteristic simplicity. He said that every time you think you've made some great spiritual progress, and then you get really annoyed at someone in a checkout line, that's not a setback. That's the curriculum. Neuroscience has something important to say about this stage too. Research on long-term meditators, people with more than 10,000 hours of practice, show structural changes in the brain. The prefrontal cortex, associated with awareness, perspective-taking, and self-regulation, shows increased thickness and density. The amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, shows reduced reactivity. In other words, the deepening of consciousness is not merely philosophical, it is neurological. The brain physically changes in ways that make the insights of awakening more accessible, more stable, and more integrated into daily life. What this stage asks of you practically is this: choose one practice and sustain it. Not because it will make you enlightened, because it will train your attention to return, again and again, to the present moment. That capacity to return is the whole game, because what awaits at the end of this deepening is not a final achievement. It's something much more radical. This is the stage that almost no YouTube channel talks about, because it doesn't look spiritual at all. Integration is the process by which all of this, the emptying, the dark night, the glimpses, the deepening, stops being a separate spiritual journey and becomes simply your life. The boundary between the sacred and the ordinary dissolves. The Zen tradition has a famous set of images called the 10 ox herding pictures. They describe the stages of awakening, from seeking to first glimpse to full realization to, and this is the one that surprises people, returning to the marketplace. The fully awakened person in the final image is not sitting on a mountaintop in robes. They're in the middle of ordinary life, at a market stall, with other people, fully engaged, fully present, leaving traces of awakening everywhere they go, not through proclamation, but simply through the quality of their presence. What integration actually means. Research published in Frontiers in Psychology in 2025 described what they called the dissolution of the perceived separation between observer and observed, the experience that underlies genuine integration. The researchers found that this isn't a state that comes and goes. For those who have moved through the earlier stages, it begins to stabilize as a baseline orientation to life. You stop being a person who sometimes has spiritual experiences. You become a person whose experience of reality has fundamentally shifted, not dramatically, not in ways that are immediately visible to others, but in ways that you can never fully go back from. What integration looks like in practice, things that used to require enormous effort, non-reactivity, compassion, equanimity, begin to emerge naturally. Not because you've perfected yourself, but because the contracted self that was generating the reactivity has loosened its grip. Your relationships change, not because you've become perfect at relationships, but because you're no longer primarily relating to people through the lens of what they offer your identity. Your work changes, not necessarily what you do, but why and how you do it. There is less grasping, less performing, less proving. And paradoxically, less urgency often produces better work. And perhaps most importantly, the suffering doesn't disappear. Pain still arises, difficulty still comes, loss, grief, frustration. All of this continues to be part of life. What changes is the relationship to suffering. It stops being personal in the way it once was. you can hold it with more spaciousness. As the Buddhist teacher Ajahn Chah put it, the mind that is awake is not the mind that has no waves. It is the mind that knows waves are waves. So, we've walked through all 5 stages: the great disillusionment, the dark night, the first glimpse, the deepening, and integration. And I want to ask you something directly. Do you recognize yourself in any of this? Because here's what I've come to believe. Having gone through this process and having studied it deeply, the fact that you're watching a video like this is itself a signal. The part of you that was drawn to this topic, that felt this was relevant, that's not random. Curiosity about consciousness, about awakening, about the deeper nature of reality, it tends to arise precisely when a person is ready to go deeper, when the surface level of life has stopped being enough. Whatever stage you find yourself in right now, whether you're in the first hollow emptiness of disillusionment, or deep in the darkness of a night that feels endless, or you've had glimpses and don't quite know what to do with them, I want to offer you this. You are not confused, you are not broken, you are not lost. You are in a process, one that has been walked by millions before you, one that every tradition that has ever seriously explored consciousness has described, and one that, if you don't abandon it, transforms everything. If this video opened something for you, if it gave language to something you've been experiencing without a name for it, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Subscribe if you want to go deeper into these questions, and leave a comment below. What stage resonated most with you? I read every single one. I'll see you in the next one.